On Christmas Day in the year 800, something happened in Rome that would reshape the destiny of an entire continent. A massive bearded warrior king knelt before the Pope in St. Peter's Basilica. As the crown touched his head, the congregation erupted. "To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peace-giving emperor of the Romans, life and victory." But here's what the history books don't tell you. This coronation was never supposed to happen. The man being crowned had arrived in Rome for an entirely different purpose. What unfolded that day was part divine providence, part political theater, and part cosmic accident that would echo through the next 1,000 years of European history. How did a semi-literate barbarian warlord from the frozen forests of Francia become the father of Europe? How did a man who couldn't write his own name create an educational revolution that saved classical literature from oblivion? And why did the most powerful ruler in the West spend his final years obsessed with a prophecy that his empire would crumble to dust? This is the story of Charlemagne, the king who dreamed of resurrecting Rome and instead gave birth to Europe itself. Picture Francia in the year 747. This is not the France you know from postcards and wine tours. This is a land of dark forests and darker superstitions where Christianity is a thin veneer over ancient pagan fears. The Merovingian kings, descendants of the legendary Frankish warlord Clovis, have grown weak and decadent. Real power lies with the mayor of the palace, a position something like a prime minister if the prime minister commanded all the armies, and the king was a figurehead who spent his days drunk in a monastery. Into this world was born Charles, son of Pepin the Short. And yes, that was his actual nickname. Pepin was indeed short, but what he lacked in height he made up for in ambition and cunning. The boy Charles, however, was anything but short. By his teenage years, he towered over other men, a giant in an age when the average height was 5'6". Contemporary accounts describe him as massive in frame, with piercing blue eyes and a flowing mustache in the Frankish style. No beards for the Franks, that was for Greeks and philosophers. But Charles had a secret that would have destroyed him in our image-obsessed age. The future emperor of the West could barely read and never learn to write properly. He would spend his entire life practicing his letters like a child, hiding wax tablets under his pillow to trace the alphabet by candlelight. In a world where literacy was power, where the written word was literally considered magical, this illiteracy should have doomed him to obscurity. Instead, it drove him to become the greatest patron of learning in 1,000 years. The transformation of Charles into Charlemagne began with blood. When Pepin died in 768, he made the fatal mistake common to Frankish kings. He divided his kingdom between his sons. Charles received the northern and western portions, while his younger brother Carloman got the south and east. It was a recipe for civil war, and everyone knew it. For 3 years, the brothers circled each other like wolves. They formed opposing alliances, raised armies, and came to the very brink of fratricide. Then in 771, Carloman suddenly died. He was 20 years old in perfect health, and the cause of death was never satisfactorily explained. His widow fled with her infant sons to seek protection from the Lombards in Italy, clearly believing Charles had murdered her husband. Did Charlemagne kill his brother? We'll never know. What we do know is that he wasted no time in seizing Carloman's kingdom, bribing or intimidating the nobles into submission. At age 24, Charles was sole ruler of the Frankish realm. The question was, what would he do with it? The answer came from an unexpected source. In 773, Pope Adrian I sent desperate messages to the Frankish court. The Lombards, those same people sheltering Carloman's family, were threatening Rome itself. The Pope needed a protector. He needed a sword. He found both in Charlemagne. What followed was not just a military campaign, but a revolution in European politics. Previous Frankish kings had raided and plundered. Charlemagne conquered and transformed. He didn't just defeat the Lombard king, he took his crown and proclaimed himself king of the Lombards. For the first time since the fall of Rome, a barbarian king was uniting different peoples under a single rule. But if Italy was a calculated political move, what came next revealed Charlemagne's true character. The Saxon Wars would consume 33 years of his reign and show both the greatness and the horror of his vision. The Saxons were everything Charlemagne's Franks had been 2 centuries earlier: pagan, tribal, and fiercely independent. They worshipped Irminsul, the world tree, and practiced human sacrifice. To Charlemagne, they represented not just a military threat but a spiritual abomination on his northeastern border. The first Saxon campaign in 772 seemed easy enough. Charlemagne marched in, destroyed the sacred pillar of Irminsul, and extracted oaths of submission. The Saxons nodded, agreed to pay tribute, and waited for him to leave. The moment his armies marched away, they rose in revolt, slaughtering Frankish garrisons and burning churches. This pattern repeated itself year after year, campaign after campaign. Charlemagne would invade, the Saxons would submit, he would leave, they would revolt. It was like trying to nail water to a wall. Each iteration grew bloodier, more desperate, more personal. The breaking point came in 782. While Charlemagne was in Spain, the Saxons ambushed and annihilated a Frankish army at Suntel, killing 2 of his closest advisors and dozens of noble commanders. When news reached Charlemagne, something snapped. The warrior who prided himself on Christian mercy became an Old Testament angel of vengeance. What happened next would haunt Charlemagne for the rest of his life. At Verden, he ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners in a single day. Not warriors caught in battle, but hostages who had already surrendered. They were beheaded one by one as their families watched. The massacre of Verden shocked even Charlemagne's own court. This wasn't war, it was genocide. Yet from this darkness came an unexpected light. The horror of Verden seemed to awaken something in Charlemagne. He began to seek other paths to conquest beyond the sword. If he couldn't defeat Saxon paganism with violence alone, perhaps he could transform it with learning and faith. Do you see the paradox forming? The illiterate warlord becoming obsessed with education. The brutal conqueror dreaming of peaceful conversion. This is what makes Charlemagne so fascinating and so human. He was not a plaster saint or a one-dimensional tyrant, but a man wrestling with contradictions that would define the nature of European civilization itself. The year 778 brought Charlemagne's most famous defeat, though you might know it better as his greatest literary triumph. Lured by promises from Muslim governors in northern Spain who were rebelling against the Emir of Córdoba, Charlemagne crossed the Pyrenees with dreams of extending his empire to the Mediterranean. It was a disaster. The promised allies proved treacherous. The cities he came to liberate barred their gates, and the Basques harassed his supply lines. After a futile siege of Zaragoza, Charlemagne ordered a retreat. As his army wound through the mountain passes, catastrophe struck. At Roncesvalles Pass, Basque warriors ambushed the Frankish rear guard. In the slaughter that followed, some of Charlemagne's finest warriors died, including his nephew Roland. The defeat was total, the humiliation complete. Charlemagne never returned to Spain, but here's where history becomes legend. 3 centuries later, anonymous poets transformed this military disaster into the Song of Roland, the national epic of France. The Basque Christians who killed Roland became an army of 400,000 Muslims. Roland himself transformed from a probably reckless commander into the perfect Christian knight, dying heroically while summoning Charlemagne with his magic horn. The myth became more real than the history. Even today, more people know the fictional Roland than the factual one. It's a reminder that Charlemagne's greatest conquest wasn't land, but imagination. Back in his palace at Aachen, Charlemagne embarked on his most ambitious project yet. If he couldn't write himself, he would ensure everyone else could. He gathered scholars from across the known world, Alcuin from England, Paul the Deacon from Italy, Theodulf from Spain. His palace school became the MIT of the Middle Ages, where the future administrators of empire learned not just Latin and theology, but mathematics, astronomy, and music. But Charlemagne went further. He ordered every monastery and cathedral to establish schools. He standardized writing itself, promoting a clear script called Carolingian minuscule that became the ancestor of our modern lowercase letters. Monks across the empire began copying ancient texts, preserving works that would otherwise have vanished forever. Without Charlemagne's copying campaign, we would have lost most of Latin literature. No Virgil, no Cicero, no Ovid. The illiterate king had become the savior of literacy itself. Yet even as Charlemagne built his educational revolution, the fundamental question remained: what exactly was he ruling? He wasn't king of France. France didn't exist yet. He held a collection of titles: king of the Franks, king of the Lombards, patrician of the Romans. His realm stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube, from the North Sea to central Italy. It was an empire in all but name. The Pope had a solution to this problem, though Charlemagne didn't know it yet. By 799, Pope Leo III was in serious trouble. The Roman nobility, tired of his corruption and brutality, had attempted to depose him, allegedly trying to gouge out his eyes and cut out his tongue. Leo fled to Charlemagne for protection. The king of the Franks now faced a delicate problem: how to restore a pope accused of perjury and adultery without appearing to judge God's representative on earth. Charlemagne's solution was masterful. He would travel to Rome not to judge the pope, but to investigate the charges. With the Frankish army camped outside the city walls, the investigation's outcome was never really in doubt. On December 23, 800, Leo swore an oath of innocence, and the matter was declared closed. 2 days later came the coronation that changed history. As Charlemagne rose from prayer on Christmas morning, Leo placed a crown on his head and declared him emperor. The congregation's acclamation shook the ancient basilica. The Western Roman Empire, dead for 324 years, had been resurrected, or had it? Einhard, Charlemagne's biographer, claims the coronation took him completely by surprise, that he would never have entered the church had he known Leo's intention. Modern historians debate whether this was genuine shock or calculated political theater. The Byzantine Empire in Constantinople certainly wasn't fooled. They had their own Roman emperor and didn't appreciate this barbarian usurper claiming their title. But the deed was done. Charlemagne was now emperor, whether he had planned it or not. The question was, emperor of what? The last 14 years of Charlemagne's reign were spent trying to answer that question. He attempted to codify laws across his diverse empire, but how do you create unified laws for peoples with completely different traditions? The Franks practiced trial by combat. The Romans preferred written evidence. The Saxons had blood feuds. The Lombards had monetary compensation. Charlemagne's solution was typically pragmatic. Let each people follow their own laws, but under imperial supervision. It was messy, inconsistent, and somehow it worked. His missi dominici, royal inspectors, traveled throughout the empire ensuring justice and rooting out corruption. They were like a medieval FBI, answerable only to the emperor himself. But even as Charlemagne built his administrative apparatus, he seemed to sense its fragility. In 806, he drew up a succession plan dividing the empire among his 3 sons, just as his father had done. It would have meant civil war and dissolution. Fortune, cruel as always, intervened. 2 of his sons died before him, leaving only Louis the Pious as heir. The physical toll of constant campaigning was catching up with the aging emperor. By 810, Charlemagne could barely mount a horse. The giant who had terrorized battlefields across Europe now walked with a pronounced limp. He spent increasing time at Aachen, bathing in the hot springs, telling war stories to young nobles who hadn't been born when he crossed the Alps. But his mind remained sharp, perhaps too sharp. In his final years, Charlemagne became obsessed with disturbing portents. Eclipses, meteors, and earthquakes all seemed to herald doom. When the wooden gallery connecting his palace to the chapel collapsed, he saw it as a sign. When his elephant, a gift from Harun al-Rashid, suddenly died, he wept like a child. Most troubling was a recurring dream. He saw his empire as a great tree, its branches covering all Europe. But the tree was hollow, eaten from within by invisible worms. One strong wind would bring it crashing down. He began frantically issuing capitularies, royal decrees, trying to shore up every weakness he could perceive. But you can't legislate away entropy. On January 28, 814, Charlemagne died. He had reigned for 46 years and lived to see himself become a legend. His son Louis inherited an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Elbe, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. It was the largest political unit Western Europe had seen since Rome. Within a generation, it had shattered into pieces. Was Charlemagne's empire doomed from the start? Perhaps. Unlike Rome, it had no unifying language. People spoke different tongues in different regions. Unlike Byzantium, it had no professional bureaucracy. Government depended on personal loyalty to the emperor. Unlike the later nation-states, it had no ethnic unity. Franks, Saxons, Lombards, and Romans had little in common except their ruler. Yet the fragments of Charlemagne's empire became the nations of modern Europe. France and Germany both claim him as their founding father. The Holy Roman Empire traced its legitimacy to his coronation. The very idea of Europe as a cultural and political unit, distinct from Asia or Africa, begins with Charlemagne. More profoundly, Charlemagne established principles that would define Western civilization. The fusion of classical learning with Christian faith. The idea that rulers had a duty to promote education and justice. The concept that diverse peoples could unite under common laws and values. These weren't original ideas, but Charlemagne made them real in ways that endured. Consider this irony. The illiterate warrior saved literacy. The brutal conqueror spread the message of Christian mercy. The barbarian king preserved Roman civilization. Charlemagne succeeded not despite his contradictions, but because of them. He bridged worlds that seemed incompatible and created something entirely new. In the monastery of St. Gall, there's a manuscript from Charlemagne's era. It's a copy of Virgil's Aeneid, saved from oblivion by Charlemagne's copying program. In the margin, a monk has drawn a small picture. A bearded king trying to write his name, tongue sticking out in concentration like a schoolboy. It's Charlemagne, the emperor who conquered Europe but never conquered the alphabet. That image captures something essential. Charlemagne's greatness lay not in perfection but in aspiration. He dreamed impossible dreams and through sheer will made them partially real. His empire crumbled, but the idea of Europe endured. His dynasty failed, but his educational reforms sparked a light that would eventually become the Renaissance. As you go about your day, consider how many things you take for granted that exist because an illiterate barbarian decided ignorance was unacceptable. The books on your shelf, the letters you're reading right now, the very concept of universal education all trace back to palace schools in Aachen where monks taught warriors to read. But perhaps Charlemagne's greatest legacy is a question that still haunts us. Is it possible to unite diverse peoples under a single system while respecting their differences? The European Union, the United Nations, every attempt at international cooperation grapples with the same challenges Charlemagne faced. How do you balance unity with diversity? How do you impose common values without destroying local traditions? Charlemagne never found perfect answers. His empire died with his grandsons torn apart by the very tensions he had tried to reconcile. But in failing gloriously, he set a template others would follow. Every European empire since has been in some sense an attempt to rebuild Charlemagne's dream. So was Charlemagne the father of Europe or its first tyrant, the savior of Western civilization or a genocidal warlord? The answer, unsatisfying as it may be, is yes, all of it. History rarely gives us pure heroes or villains, and Charlemagne embodies this complexity perfectly. In Aachen today, you can visit Charlemagne's chapel, now part of a Gothic cathedral. His throne still stands there, a simple stone chair worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims. 31 Holy Roman emperors sat in that chair for their coronations, each trying to channel a fragment of Charlemagne's authority. But the real monument to Charlemagne isn't stone or gold. It's the idea that barbarians can become civilized, that warriors can become scholars, that the sword and the book need not be enemies. It's the notion that from the chaos of fallen empires, something new and possibly better can arise. As Europe faces new challenges, as the world grapples with how to unite without uniformity, the ghost of Charlemagne still whispers across the centuries. Not with answers, but with the right questions. How do we build institutions that outlast their founders? How do we preserve the best of the past while embracing necessary change? How do we create unity from diversity? These were Charlemagne's questions. They remain ours. And perhaps that's his greatest legacy. Not an empire that lasted forever, but problems worth solving for all time. The barbarian who couldn't write his name became the architect of European civilization. The king who lived by the sword ensured the pen would endure. The emperor whose realm fragmented created an idea of unity that survives to this day. Remember Charlemagne not as marble statue or golden icon, but as a man wrestling with impossible challenges and refusing to accept defeat. In that struggle, in that magnificent failure that somehow became success, lies a lesson for anyone who dreams of leaving the world better than they found it. The empire crumbled, the idea endured, and sometimes that's enough to change the world.